Hi there, everybody. We're going to be doing our recording for this week's lecture since we had our exam last night. And we're going to be talking about rural and migrant health, tobacco use, alcoholism, things like that. I really want you to watch this first video that I have for you on rural healthcare and just see what kind of environment is going on with these type of clients. So I'm going to share my screen with you and we're going to take a look at this video.
Reed Island, Surge Narrows, it's rural. We're off-grid. I moved to Reed Island about 11 years ago when I retired. I've been coming here since I was 2 years old because my mother was raised here. Having any services here is a bonus.
When we first arrived, there was no nurse practitioner, no doctor, and in order to get to a doctor, we had to go into Campbell River.
I was a nurse in an emergency setting in a rural place, and I got frustrated by seeing people come into emergencies having nowhere else to go.
We haven't had anybody up here for years and years until nurse practitioner Pat started coming to Reed Island.
This has made a huge difference to the people that don't have boats and don't have a car.
It saved trips to Campbell River for us to get meds renewed, for instance. They can take samples and take them into the labs for you.
You know, most people want to have a practitioner that they know they're going to see for a while, where they can develop a relationship.
We've got people in their 70s and 80s up here where it's so much easier for them to stay on their island.
The nurse practitioner promotes better health care. She has talks about different things.
It's the old-time country-type care that we're getting. Yeah, it's been good for us.
Okay, so we're going to stop right there. So I wanted to show you that video. It gives you a little sense of what rural America can look like. So they have 80 people in that community, and in that community, there is not a hospital for many miles. There's nothing that can service them. They're trying to get more nurses into rural healthcare because of that. So I want you to think when we look at this about what you'll see in rural America and how that will impact healthcare as well as the migrant workers. So to remember, rural is going to be based on a population. We're going to take a look at our PowerPoints in a minute, which will define that. There's a show that's on Netflix right now that is a great portrayal of a nurse practitioner in rural America. It's on Netflix. I forget the name right now, but anyway, it's something River. And so it's a really good depiction of what rural America looks like and how pediatrics, grown adults, pregnant patients, all the different spectrum is cared for by these healthcare practitioners. So we're going to take a look at our PowerPoints on for our, let's stop sharing for a second. We're going to take a look at our PowerPoints that we have for this week as well. And so we're going to start with our chapter 22, which is going to be our rural healthcare. And I want you to think about, as we're looking at this, several things that we want to share and think about as being nurses in that community. So let's look at chapter 22. It's rural and migrant health. Know that here we're going to be looking at how we have a lack of access to healthcare. So it's not something that we can solve. It's a problem in rural areas, including farms. Remember, our farms are going to rely on our migrant workers, and migrant workers are going to need to harvest crops and work as far as that. You know, lack of healthcare professionals, poverty, limited access to service, lack of knowledge, and social isolation are some of our problems that we see among our rural communities. For the migrant workers, think about our language barriers and cultural differences that often occur. So when we look at rural, we're going to have fewer than 20,000 residents or less than 99 people per square mile. In our urban areas, we're going to have more than 99 people per square mile, in cities with a population of 20,000, but fewer than 50,000 in our non-farming areas. So think about moving to rural areas. We're seeing the fastest growing rural communities growing along our larger metropolitan counties. So metaphorically, we refer to this as the donut effect. And the donut effect is people are moving away from those heavy populated cities to more affordable housing in our rural areas. But that presents a problem for us as far as healthcare is concerned. And when we take a look at it, what we're going to look at is our population characteristics. So this is pretty, has been researched and has been found that in general, there's a higher proportion of whites in these rural areas, higher than average number of younger 16 to 17, 6 to 17, and those older groups like we just heard in the video. Persons who are 18 and older are going to be more likely married. Much fewer years of formal education, tend to be poorer, and less formal schooling than our urban communities. So how is that going to help us as we look at their health status? So in the rural residents, we see a poorer perception of their overall health and functional status. They're less likely to engage in our preventative stuff like our screenings and things like that. They tend to have poorer health, and they are less likely to seek out medical care. They have more chronic conditions like heart disease, COPD, hypertension. And this can be related to, and really think about how often are they going to see the doctors. So traveling time and distance to ambulatory cares is going to affect our access. We don't see a lot of those big hospitals in the rural areas. Our healthcare providers are going to provide care to people who live in several places, and we're going to have a big shortage in our rural areas. When we look at women's health in the rural community, it seems that we have a higher infant and maternal morbidity rates. Is this because we're not getting the follow-up that we are in more of an urban setting? That's something to think about. We have a high proportion of racial minorities and fewer specialists. You know, the big specialists are going to go to the big city hospitals and stay away from these rural communities. Particularly at risk are women who live on or near Indian reservations, migrant workers, and live in rural counties in the Deep South. Oftentimes we see these groups of women being victims to sexual assault. When we look at our children, our urban children are more likely to see a pediatrician only when they're ill. So this may be why we see more chronic conditions popping up. You're going to have a general practitioner as a caregiver. The children are working on farms. I want you to remember, when working on farms, we're going to be exposed to things like pesticides and things that are being sprayed without them knowing it. School nurses are going to play a huge part in the rural communities. But again, there's the schools cover such a large area that you'll have one school nurse for several hundred miles. As far as mental health, we see that they delay seeking care unless it's an emergency or a crisis. They're more persistent, higher rates of depression because due to the high rate of poverty or geographic isolation and not a lot of mental health services out there. We see domestic violence frequently because these people are living alone. They may not have the support systems. And we see a lot of alcohol, tobacco, and other drug use. High-risk industries we find in the rural areas like forestry, mining, fishing, agriculture. Health risks are going to include machinery and vehicular accidents, trauma, infectious disease, eye problems, certain types of cancers. Think about our respiratory system, how that's going to be related to exposure to toxins, pesticides, and herbicides. Farming and ranching are not usually regulated by OSHA. So we think about small enterprises, and our safety may be compromised as far as that's concerned. What do we see as our barriers to care in the rural community? We see is it available? We talked about how it's hard to get healthcare providers out in these areas. Affordability, accessibility, and services and professions. So sorry. Oops. We help to design community health programs for our peoples. Our health of minorities, migrant workers, we talked about this. The Health Act, we see a lot of pesticides being used. We have health centers Housing is a concern. Lack of knowledge about services. Remember, we're worried about languages. Inability to afford the care. Is there services in these migrant communities? Transportation. They're working long hours, so they're not able to get to their healthcare facilities. We see a feeling of discrimination among them. We have cultural aspects. We want to be very sensitive to culture. Dental disease, we see an incidence of TB and HIV, depression, anxiety, domestic violence, and our children are important in our migrant community. Things to consider is our relationship. We have to be very sensitive to different beliefs, different languages, different practices. And we look at in our nursing care in rural environments, it's going to be community oriented and it's going to vary. We see a big need for school nurses, family planning, care for individuals, emergency care, children with special needs, and services for other adults. We're going to continue with case management and community health needs with our primary health care facilities in the rural communities. When we look at Healthy People 2020, we're going to consider our rural factors like our population, our remoteness, our scarcity of resources, personal shortages, physical, emotional, and social isolation, and see how the community must be involved in developing the plans and assuming some ownership of it. So we're going to think about how can we use our resources to help our migrant communities. Remember, a great way that we can touch these communities, they may not have healthcare providers there. We're going to use text messaging, telehealth, telephone, and video conferencing. Okay, so that really covers that chapter. I want you to focus on the migrant and the rural clients and what they may be needing at that time. We're going to move on to our vulnerable populations. At this point, that is our next section that we're going to look at. You're going to be doing a project on vulnerable populations in your community, and we'll talk about that at the beginning of next class. That's going to be due in week 9, I believe. So when we look at our vulnerable populations, we touched on this just briefly in our last chapter, but we're going to be very specific here. We're going to look at our clients experiencing poverty, homelessness, teen pregnancy, and mental illness. So we look at our 4 main groups who are going to represent the poor, the homeless, pregnant teens, and those who are mentally ill. We need to think about how our own beliefs, be careful of our judgments and our barriers that we have when we're looking at them. Very important for the nurse to identify your own healthcare beliefs before you're caring for those that are less fortunate than yourselves. We're going to look at our attitudes, beliefs, and media communication about these groups. So cultural attitudes are the beliefs and perspectives that a society values. So when we see the media communicates thoughts and attitudes through literature, through film, through art, through television, newspapers, you'll see plenty of pictures out there about our vulnerable populations, and they're oftentimes presented with a negativity. First and foremost is going to be poverty and homelessness. Know that it's going to affect our health status when we see this poverty on the basis of income, family size, age of the household, number of children. Persistent poverty is going to refer to our individuals and our families who remain poor for long periods of time and pass that poverty on. Why we are seeing an increase in our poverty population, we see decreased earnings, increased unemployment, decreasing Social Security to children, increased number. We see a large group of single women now being having children and in the poverty sector. So as we look at health, we see higher rates of chronic illness, higher infant mortality and morbidity. May this be because they're not having the health care they need, shorter life expectancy, more health problems, and severe complications. We see that oftentimes in our ERs, we're going to get large numbers of poverty-struck individuals because they don't have that primary care. So they go to the ERs in order to do that. Effects is going to have a negative effect on adolescent women, children, adults, and both of our communities. When we take a look at homelessness, this is another huge group. Hard to know exactly how many people are going to be homeless, but we do look at the way to figure that out. Our homeless definition is going to be our Stewart, defined in our Stewart Stuart McKinley Homeless Assistance Act, which I want you to guys look up in your reading. So what happens to our homeless? We see hypothermia, heat-related illnesses because they don't have the, stable homes, infestation, poor skin integrity, diabetes, nutritional, TB, HIV, trauma. We're going to see a parallel here with our rural communities as well. Our at-risk population for the homeless are going to be pregnant women, children, adolescents. There's a lot of running away that happens at an adolescence, and they don't know that there is nowhere to stay. So trends in adolescent sexual behavior, we're seeing that teens are making better decisions. We look at a reproductive health care to teens, factors that can become whether a young person can become pregnant. We're seeing an increase in support during pregnancy among our healthcare providers. So the reason we're talking about this again is, remember, we're talking about our vulnerable population of our pregnant adolescents. So we look at their background factors, sexual activity, young men, and how do they play a part. A lot of young men don't want to partake in that. We're seeing concerns with that. And we see among this population a lot of violence, poor nutrition, infant care, and special needs. Mental illness, we have a high prevalence rate across the lifespan. Those that we can focus on maybe is to really look at our at-risk groups. Again, we have children, adolescents, adults with serial mental illness is at our with our concern. Our levels of prevention with our vulnerable populations, we're going to look at affordable housing, housing subsidiaries, job training programs. Secondary prevention, we're going to reduce the prevalence of a condition that they have. We're going to have emergency housing. We're going to have soup kitchen for food, and we're going to have screening for depression. And then our tertiary, we're going to help for promotion of psychosocial rehab programs for those that are in this vulnerable population. Us as a nurse, we're going to make sure that we do like we always do, create a trusting environment, show respect, compassion, and concern. I can't emphasize enough your biases and how that's going to impact the way you're treating your vulnerable population. You're going to develop a network of support for your self so that when you're going through this with your patients, you can get some help from others. And there's a nice role here, and it says know when to walk beside the client and when to encourage the client to walk ahead. So what we really want you to think about is we're going to be helping this vulnerable population to do the best they can do, but also we want to give them some leeway so that they're able to develop their own networks. All right, that covers our second chapter, and I'm going to stop the lecture at this point. We will cover tobacco, alcohol, and other addictions at the beginning of class next week. I want to introduce you to an assignment that you guys will have, and that's going to be your vulnerable population assignment. So I'm going to pull up our syllabus. We'll take a look at that and at the rubric, and we can also discuss that at the beginning of class next week as well. So just give me 1 second while I pull that up. So it's in week 9, we're going to have our vulnerable population assignment, and there's a rubric for you guys that you will be able to take a look at. We're going to be using APA format on this as well as we are. I'm going to share the screen with you right now. Okay, so we're going to take a look at vulnerable population in your community. You're going to drive around, you're going to find one of those and complete a windshield survey. Okay, windshield survey is what you really see when you're looking out the window. You're going to identify the population in detail, the health risks and needs, and service gaps, interventions, primary, secondary, and tertiary, that'll fill these and summarize. We're going to be doing this with a PowerPoint presentation. You're doing it individually, so everybody's going to tell me something that's in their community. And here's an example of those that we may look at to consider as our vulnerable populations. So here is detail. You're going to describe in detail demographics, religion, ethnicity, culture, employment, socioeconomic status, and lifestyle behaviors, health promotion, resources that we're going to look at, programs, services. We're going to have gaps that we're going to examine. And we're going to summarize research plans that are in the making for health promotion and health risks. So I wanted you guys to take a look at that. That is in week 9. I do expect you to start working on that. As far as this week is concerned, we had our our exam this week. We had our case study. I want you guys to be up on your reading for next week. Let's take a look at what chapters we have there. We have 29 and 30. I will tell you that I want you to get ahead of your reading, because what's ending up happening is in the next couple of weeks, we'll have a lot more chapters to read. So make sure this week you're reading 22, 23, and 24. In preparation for class next week, I want you to reread 24, 29, and 30. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. At this point, I'm going to end the lecture, and I tried to keep it as brief as I could, just so that you guys have some time to do reading, and we will discuss the last chapter next week. Take care and please be in touch.